Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be able to be here to present this information, because it means that something that I've been involved with for the past 6 years has been a success. Let me start out with acknowledgements of all the people involved and agencies involved in making this happen. My participation in this project has been assisting my good friend and colleague, Dr. Douglas Stanton, who is Director of Heritage of the Government of Nunavut. So I've been my participation has been on behalf of the Government of Nunavut, but this project has involved the Canadian Coast Guard, the Canadian Hydrographic Service, Parks Canada, and several other partners in the project. And so, as you'll see, they were all involved in this. There's been a lot of media coverage recently. This is my favorite headline of all of them. This sounds like a great story. And I wish that was the story I was going to tell. It's not exactly the story that I'm going to tell. But for 169 years, people have been viewing the Franklin expedition through their own lenses. This is one particular, it's the local story from Greenhithe. And we continue to look at this story through our own lenses. I've actually been, throughout my career, on the fringes of the story. My very first time in what would eventually become Nunavut, it was the Northwest Territories now, was in 1982 on a place called Prince of Wales Island. And I actually took this picture from the south coast of Prince of Wales Island precisely because I was looking at the ice at the place where I knew that John Franklin's expedition had ended up. And so this picture has always reminded me, and we actually, doing archaeology on Inuit sites, found a piece of metal that my supervisor at the time wasn't sure, but now in retrospect things did come from the Franklin expedition. Then later in the 1980s, I was a teaching assistant with Owen Beatty, who I'll talk about in a little while, but who was very much involved in the study of the Franklin expedition. And since 2008, I've been involved in a renewed search for the ships of the Franklin expedition, but the Government of Nunavut's role in this and goal in this was finding the ships, but also doing other things as well, as I'll explain. The people involved in making this happen included a lot of skilled and dedicated scientists. But in this project, I was actually the only one, normally, who wasn't employed by a government. So that was actually an interesting experience for a university professor, working with a lot of government scientists. That's been in the media a lot, and I got an interesting perspective on that as well, as I'll mention. Finally, going back to my previous slide, it's been interesting to see how the media coverage has portrayed scientists and this particular find. Again, people look at this through a variety of different lenses. It's not that any of them are particularly wrong, but there are a lot of different ways of looking at that. So my role has been as sort of a knowledgeable insider working on the project, involved in a lot of it, but I actually wasn't making a lot of the big decisions. So I'll ask you to understand that as I go through my presentation. I want to start with a Northwest Passage. Everybody knows that term, but it's not clear to me that everyone has known what it is. Certainly when I talk to students and things like that, they recognize it. But for what it's worth, there is no geographical feature known as the Northwest Passage. Google Maps gets around that by talking about Northwest Passages. But I just want to explain why Franklin was where he was and why we found what we did. So we have to go back to 1500s England, who wanted to get at the wealth of the East Indies. But they had a big geographical problem. One possibility was that they could sail from England down south around Africa and then east to the Indies, but at that time Portugal was a major naval power and they controlled the sea lanes around that route, so that really wasn't open to English sailors. Another alternative was to sail around South America, south there, and then head west to the Indies, but Spain controlled that route, so that route wasn't really open to the English. Oops. Let me somehow. A third opportunity, or an option, was to sail north from England and then head east across the top of Asia, that there might be a route that way, and they actually did try this, but they ran into ice pretty quickly, and so that wasn't possible. So options were to go south and east, south and west, north and east. None of those worked. So the last potential option to get to that wealth of the Indies was to go north and west. So it was simply finding some route that they could actually sail that would reach that. And so a bunch of people tried. I'm going to give a very condensed history of it with a few of the main people involved. In these maps, as I think should be evident, the areas that I've shaded out essentially were not known at the time. And so one of the first and most famous, or early famous explorers, was Martin Frobisher, who 3 times in the 1570s, 1576, 77, and 78, sailed up to what we now know as Frobisher Bay in Baffin Island, although for about 300 years where he'd actually been was lost to knowledge. But his expedition sort of devolved into a search for gold, and so he didn't get very far. In 1611, sad-looking Henry Hudson there sailed into what we now call, in his honor, Hudson Bay. He didn't sail out. Some of his crew did, but they abandoned him there. But that was looking for a Northwest Passage, but it sort of ended up being a dead end. Jumping ahead a little bit, in the 1770s, the other direction for the Northwest Passage was begun to be explored by Captain Cook, so getting up into Alaska. Around the same time, some explorers tried to go overland, or did go overland through what would become Canada, and reached the shores of the Arctic Ocean in a couple of places, Samuel Hearne and Alexander Mackenzie. And so their brief forays to the Arctic Ocean revealed that there was water up there, which was encouraging to people who were interested in a Northwest Passage. But if you look at those dates and know a little bit about world history, you know that the British by this point got sort of involved in other things, and so we're busy for a while. And then my obligatory, since we're at the University of Waterloo, thing is after the Battle of Waterloo, Britain, who had spent more than 2 decades building up this huge navy and essentially knocking all the other navies of the world off the scene, had control of the oceans, or effective control of the oceans, but they also had an awful lot of underemployed sailors. And they wanted something to keep them busy. And so one of the things they thought of, even though there was now absolutely no real economic rationale for doing so, was, well, let's complete that Northwest Passage. So I've left out several people here, but you can see that the map by that point was getting exposed. And one of the people, one of these unemployed sailors, or underemployed sailors that they sent north, was a young commander named John Franklin. He'd been a successful naval officer. He'd served at Trafalgar under Nelson. And he was sent overland through Canada, and he made it to the shores of the Arctic Ocean and explored by small boat, and added a chunk of geography to the map. His expedition was almost a catastrophe. For some people it was. Several people died. But he wrote a very popular book when he got back describing the travails of this expedition, and he became famous for that. He was sent back on that basis and had a much more successful, at least for all the people involved, expedition where he mapped a whole bunch more of the Arctic coastline. I'm jumping around a bit in time here, so jump back a few years. At the same time Franklin was sent out the first time, some seaborne expeditions, some ship expeditions were sent out, and one of them was led by William Perry, who sailed through what we now know as Lancaster Sound. It was a tremendously successful expedition. He got a long way to what's now Melville Island there in the west. He concluded that going further wouldn't work, that wasn't going to be a viable Northwest Passage, because the ice he could see beyond that was clearly not ever going to break up. But he overwintered, and Perry sort of pioneered the British Navy's way of using ships for Arctic exploration. They sailed around until it got to be autumn and the ice started forming, And then they would locate a nice little harbor, and the ice would be already forming close to shore. They would use big saws and cut a channel to get their ships into a nice, snug little harbor. This was important because if they'd sort of wintered in the pack ice, the ice might shift and crush their ships. And if you go online and Google Shackleton and endurance, there's actually footage from 1911, I believe, of a ship getting crushed by the ice. So this effectively avoided that. These ships were packed with stores, so they created snow hoses, and they unloaded a lot of the stores off the ships into structures that they built outside so that the ships would be more comfortable inside for people. They covered over the decks with tents, and they built up snow around the outside of the ships and made them quite snug for the winter. And they would pass the long winter this way in these ships. The ice wouldn't break up again until sort of July or probably August, so it'd be a long time they'd spend this way. But it was very successful. When spring came around, or late summer actually, the ice would break up and they would continue their explorations. On that expedition, Perry only spent one winter in the Arctic, but he was sent back almost immediately. And since his route through Lancaster Sound didn't work for Northwest Passage, he tried something else. He came in through Hudson Strait, but instead of going south into Hudson Bay, he went north, thinking that that might be a Northwest Passage. He did find a passage, but again, it was one that you couldn't actually sail through. But he spent 2.5 years, spent 2 winters in the Arctic at what is today the community of Igloolik in Nunavut. He had on his 2 ships 118 crew and officers, and in those 2.5 years, only 5 of them died. 1 of them by accident. He fell from the rigging. The other, so it was a very small, low mortality. It was they could do this. They could spend a couple of years in the Arctic without any great difficulty. The next expedition, chronologically and from my perspective, was one led by Captain John Ross. He was a naval officer, but this was actually a private expedition that he led on a very small, well, he had 2 ships, but a very small one. He only took 23 sailors in. But he headed for a gap that Perry had noticed in his earlier expedition that headed south and he thought might end up being Northwest Passage. It wasn't. There was no way to get west from where he ended up. His ship also got frozen in, and over the next couple of winters in the spring, it did not thaw out again. So Ross and his crew had to abandon their ship. They actually went overland north and got up to the north end of Baffin Island, where they flagged down a whaling ship. Whalers were working in this area by that point and escaped after 4.5 years, 58 months in the Arctic. But of the crew of 23, 3 of them died. So 13% mortality, but that's 4.5 years in the Arctic using British naval knowledge and techniques. So it was a near-run thing, but they did survive. So, but the fact, he'd already been given up for dead back in England, back in Britain by the time he came back. So by this time, that demographic bulge in the Navy was sort of gone through the system. And the fact that this was such a near-run expedition meant that there wasn't any real need for another expedition, but it was gnawing a few people in the British Navy. And so in 1845, they decided to have one last expedition. Let's complete this thing. There's no economic need for this, but for naval prestige, for geographic knowledge, let's complete this thing. And what they decided was that whoever led the expedition would sail into Lancaster Sound that Perry had got. Perry had noticed another gap west of the gap that Ross had followed at a place called Cape Walker. The orders for this expedition were to head to Cape Walker, head south, find your way somehow through that unknown area, and if you reached the Arctic mainland, they knew that it was possible to sail. By this point, I haven't mentioned a few people, it was possible to sail all the way out. So it seemed fairly straightforward. They tried to interest Perry and a couple of other people in the command. The person that they ended up choosing was one of their famous Arctic heroes, Sir John Franklin. One of the things that's so evocative about this story is that we have actual photographs of these people taken just before the expedition. So a nice heroic-looking portrait, but also Franklin's photograph. He apparently had a bad cold that day. He wasn't very happy. And of course, you had to pose for a long time in the photographs for these things, but it is pretty impressive being able to see these things. He'd done Arctic exploration before, of course. His expeditions had been overland, but he was considered an Arctic expert, and he was given 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, that had been used in Antarctic exploration just the decade earlier, and they were completely refitted out for this new Arctic expedition. They were re-strengthened, they had all the basic conveniences. They were refitted with steam engines as well. Locomotive engines were put in to provide them with the possibility to steam a little bit, but if they were facing bad winds and they just needed to get a short distance, the steam would give them the ability to do that. So the Navy gave them every possibility of success. So the last time anyone saw them, until just a couple of weeks ago actually, it was July 26, 1845, when a whaling ship saw Erebus and Terror. They were waiting in Baffin Bay, waiting to enter Lancaster Sound, waiting for the ice to clear. Franklin had apparently speculated that he might be possible to get through in just 1 year, so he might come out the other end later that year, but he thought it was likely that they would have to spend at least 1 winter in the Arctic. But as the years went by, no sign of them. So Lady Franklin there and our friend John Ross. John Ross, having got stuck, having got iced in the Arctic, was one of the first people to get really concerned. By 1847, when Franklin and his crew hadn't appeared, Ross started agitating for, we better send out a search expedition, a rescue expedition. But that was rejected. People knew that the Erebus and Terror had supplies for 3 full years, so that they could survive pretty easily. But by 1848 and increasing after that, they did start sending out search expeditions. And this was a massive undertaking by the British Navy, but also private people got involved as well. Sort of a theme in this talk. American newspaper journalists sent expeditions. So the world was fixated by this story. Between particularly 1850 and 1854, a lot of expeditions went out. And the strategy that the searchers used, they would sail in following Perry's strategy, get iced in the autumn, and then go through the dark period of the winter. And then in the spring, when the light came back and the temperature got a little better, the crews would set out with sledges, and they would drag these sledges, and they traveled hundreds of kilometers searching the shores of the Arctic for the Franklin expedition. And apart from finding where Franklin had spent his first winter, they didn't find anything. Bizarrely, they could not find anything. By 1854, the government gave up and officially declared all the crew members of the Franklin expedition dead. This obviously had pension issues for widows and families and things like that, but also the Crimean War was looming on the horizon. Britain had other things it needed its navy to do, so they sort of got out fairly quickly. But right about the same time that was happening, a fascinating guy named John Rae, who actually lived in Hamilton for a short time, but he was one of the first Europeans who really got into traveling in the Arctic the way the Inuit did. He believed in walking through the Arctic. And he was traveling in the Arctic in this area, what's near the present-day community of Talojuak, and he encountered Inuit who told him that a bunch of Kalunat, white guys essentially, had died several years earlier southwest of where Rae was. And they also sold him a bunch of stuff that they had got from these people, and some of these items were clearly from the Franklin expedition. That spoon there has Sir John Franklin's crest in it, so it comes from his own personal service. So Rae had evidence, the first tangible evidence of the Franklin expedition, and he had a story that they'd all died in that area, and also the Inuit told him that some of the last survivors had resorted to cannibalism. Ray felt that this was really important news, and so rather than going and checking it out himself, he headed back to where he came from and then headed to England with this important news. His story caused controversy back in Great Britain. Not so much that everybody was dead, they'd already given up on that, but the possibility that the last survivors had resorted to cannibalism was considered totally shocking and couldn't possibly be true. So Ray was reviled. Famously, Charles Dickens took on this and sort of wrote tracts accusing the Inuit of having done this. General exhaustion, though, even though this news now gave people a place to look, led the government to decide not to send another expedition. So Lady Franklin took several years to scrounge together enough money from donations and things like that to send out a small private expedition. And so it was led by Leopold McClintock. His second in command was William Hobson. I know you can't quite see that, but the ship they sent out was the Fox. Again, it was a small private expedition, and it seemed to be cursed. They set out in 1857, but got stuck in Baffin Bay for that whole winter, so they didn't get into the Arctic archipelago until 1858, and that meant they had to winter near where it says the Fox in the middle of this map, and it was only in the spring of 1859 that they were able to get down into the area that Ray's informants had told him was where Franklin's expedition had ended up. And so from the Fox, they sledded down the coast of Boothia Peninsula and then split up. McClintock sent Hobson, his second in command, essentially counterclockwise, west around King William Island to the area that they were told, whereas McClintock himself went all the way around and down to the areas where the last survivors were supposed to have been, and then he came back up. People have regarded this as fairly generous of McClintock because it meant that Hobson would likely find some of the most interesting things, and indeed he did. The most famous thing that Hobson found was the Cairn Note. One of these lovely London Illustrated News or Illustrated London News illustrations, quite unrealistic. There's no way they would have been using pickaxes. You usually take these things apart by hand, take apart the rocks, but they found a cairn like that, a pile of rocks, clearly human-made, opened it up, and inside it they found the one significant written document that's ever been found so far from the Franklin expedition. It's on a pre-printed piece of stationery that the expedition was given that was supposed to be left at various kinds of locations. And it contains two messages. It's fairly complicated. But the earlier message, when the thing was first deposited, was this. On the 28th of May, 1847, Her Majesty's ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice at latitude 70 degrees, longitude 98 degrees, having wintered in 1845-46 at Beechey Island, after having ascended Wellington Channel and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. Franklin's camp at Beechey Island had been found, but this is sort of the first information about what had happened. So if you'll forgive me, from that note, we can reconstruct that Franklin and his crews sailed into the Arctic. They probably went to exactly where his orders told him to go, which was Cape Walker, and he was supposed to go to Cape Walker and then head south. Odds are he got there and he couldn't because there was ice. So he did what his backup orders said: if you can't go south, go north. So he did that. He went up around Cornwallis Island, probably realized there wasn't a route there, sailed back down, and then did what Perry would have done. He found a nice snug little harbor at a place called Beechey Island and overwintered there, 45-46. Then the next year, we presume, based on the note, he sailed and followed his orders. And this is probably the worst luck that the Franklin expedition had, that he actually followed his orders. But that note says that in the autumn of 1846, they got down to this point, northwest of King William Island, and got stuck in the ice. Just to digress a little bit, well, why hadn't all those searchers found him? Because Franklin had followed his orders. He'd done exactly what he was told to do, and the searchers knew what his orders were, so why hadn't they found out where he'd gone? Well, one of the first things the searchers did in 1848 and years afterwards was go to this point, Cape Walker, but they found that was totally choked with ice. every year, and multi-year ice. It looked like it never melted. So when I say that Franklin had really bad luck, the really bad luck he probably had was in that summer of 1846 that actually opened up, because at that time it happened very, very rarely. So that was some of the worst luck he had. So that note sounded good so far, but then something was added to the note. On April 25th, 1848, Her Majesty's ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on 22nd of April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since 12th of September, 1846. So for almost 2 years, they'd been stuck in the ice. Clearly, the ice hadn't broken up in the summer of 1847. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, landed here. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. So shortly after that previous note was written, actually, he died. And the total loss by deaths in the expedition had been, to this date, 9 officers and 15 men. Now this it has long been regarded as significant. In less than 3 years, 24 out of the 129 people on board had died, 18.6%. So a much higher rate of death than those earlier expeditions. And it was also very odd that 9 officers and 15 men, the ratio of officers to men on the ship wasn't nearly like that. So officers were clearly dying at a higher rate. But then it's signed by James Fitzjames, captain of the Erebus, who took over from Franklin when Franklin died, and Francis Crozier, captain and senior officer. And then, as sort of an afterthought, they said, and start on tomorrow, 26 for Back's Fish River. So they'd abandoned the ships, and they were going to try to get out of the Arctic overland. So from that one little sentence, we can conclude that their escape plan was essentially, that's where they left the ships, was to head down here, and Back's Fish River is sort of at the bottom of this slide here, and goes way inland. They could eventually, if they traveled a long way inland, reach Hudson's Bay posts. But they prepared boats to take with them, ship's boats, and clearly they were going to try to walk and then sail upriver to get out of the Arctic. But from what the Inuit tell us and from what later research has done, they didn't make it. The furthest any of the survivors made it appears to be about there, where the Inuit said that they died. Now, McClintock and Hobson found one other really evocative thing that I'll come back to later on. In what later became called Erebus Bay, they found the so-called boat place, which was they found one of the ship's boats associated with a couple of dead sailors with a lot of stuff in it on a sled frozen in. And this wonderful illustration sort of shows it very dramatically. And this image, although not of this particular boat, sort of became sort of iconic for the Franklin expedition. This was a much later 1895 painting, and this isn't that boat, but it's how they imagined the last of Franklin's survivors, because they were dragging boats on sledges, died in the harness. And wouldn't have been Franklin, but I mean, you got to think of Stan Rogers, the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea there, that guy, Crozier, Fitzjames, whoever. But so that is sort of the image of what happened that came from McClintock and Hobson's project. But after 1859, after that, there were still lots of unanswered questions about why, reading what I wrote here, the catastrophic and completely unexpected failure of the expedition. This really wasn't seen as dangerous. Those of us of a certain age sort of remember the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. It's about the same thing. People had got used to this being fairly safe and reliable, and suddenly this catastrophic failure. What could possibly have explained it? The note, the Cairn note, didn't really explain that. So how to answer those questions? And couple of things came to mind to people, obviously. Find more documents. These ships, expeditions, they would have been crammed with the ship's logs, officers' journals. There would have been a lot of stuff written down during this time. You didn't have a whole lot to do during the winter, but write notes to things yourself. So there would have been a lot of writing on board these ships that might explain what was going on. So find more of those papers and talk to the Inuit. Find out more about what they observed. And so a couple of individuals who did this not long afterwards, one of them was a guy named Charles Francis Hall, who was an American journalist, fascinating character. Like Ray, he believed that one needed to live like the Inuit to travel in the Arctic. He's famous, to me, one of the things he did was he went and practiced living with the Inuit for a while before he actually went searching for Franklin. He did this in what we now know as Frobisher Bay, but he actually rediscovered where Martin Frobisher had been. It had been forgotten for practically 3 centuries. People didn't know it, but he found that out. And he also discovered that the Inuit in Frobisher Bay had a really good oral tradition of Martin Frobisher having been there after almost 300 years. So he had a great respect for the oral traditions of the Inuit. Hall did not get into the area, or much of the area where the Franklin expedition ended up. He got to the southeastern corner of King William Island there, but he did talk to a lot of Inuit. And one of the most famous, sorry, that's a bit cut off, but it's probably not a problem. He transliterated this person's name as Inuktitut. That's my pronunciation, which is really bad. I do not pronounce Inuktitut well. But he got Inuktitut, he talked to them through an interpreter, and he got them to draw a map. And so Pusajuk drew the map on the left on a piece of paper that Hall did, and it's actually very recognizable. King William Island is obviously the same. Matty Island is sort of that curved island up there. You've got the Royal Geographical Society's island, and Pusajuk's map is actually a little more accurate than Google Earth's, because Google Earth sort of puts the 2 islands into one. There's some points here, Grant Point in particular, which I'll come to again, would sort of show up. And this gap here, this body of water, Sherman Inlet, which is there as well. So his map is very interpretable. This is a map he drew. He'd probably never seen maps before, but he drew this. But what's important is he noted that at this location, a place he called Ukjulik, one of Franklin's ships had sunk. And so if you sort of transliterate that on the map based on the other locations, it ends up about there north of O'Reilly Island, which I'll show you later on. So 1869, it was known, based on Hall's work, that one of the ships had drifted down there, had got down there, and ended up there. Someone else who sort of had the same idea that Hall did about going and getting writings, this was really what he wanted to do, was an American Army officer named Frederick Schwatka. And between 1878 and 79, he made an amazing expedition with some companions and Inuit, all the way up to King William Island, the north end of King William Island, and then came back along the coast. And the whole goal was to search for remains of the Franklin expedition that had been left behind by the sailors after they abandoned the ships, especially documents. But he talked to Inuit as well. And one of the things the Inuit told him was that they certainly had found things that to Schwatka sounded like books, but Inuit didn't have any sense of what these were or what to do with them. They'd given them to the kids to play with, and the kids had sort of torn them up. And so there's this sort of description of them sort of blowing across the tundra or something like that. So Schwatka didn't find any writings, but he did talk to Inuit as well, more Inuit, and you can see on his map there, he added ship sank. I'll just zoom in a little bit there, but just west of Grant Point, and if you sort of translate that into the modern locations, it's up there someplace. That's what he was told, and he had actually several people sort of described it, the location to him. So putting these descriptions together, Inuktitut and others put it down here north of O'Reilly Island. Some of Schwatka's informants put it up here. But if you look at the scale down at the bottom there, that's 10 kilometers. It's not a vast area. So they were clearly talking about the same thing. Clearly, one of Franklin's ships had ended up down there. They also told him a little bit about this, or told Hall and Schwatka that the other ship appears to have been crushed in the ice, although this is really hard to interpret because they sort of described learning this from some of the Franklin survivors in mind, because none of the Franklin crew could speak Inuktitut. But so, coming from that, getting near to the modern time, we ended up with the idea that there were 2 areas where a Franklin ship would likely be found. A southern search area down here, based on the Inuit testimony, and a northern search area, someplace south of where the ships were abandoned, where a northern ship had been crushed in the ice and sunk, because that seemed to be the story that the Inuit were telling Schwatka. So how to search for these ships? It actually is a little bit difficult because that line there sort of shows the modern quote-unquote Northwest Passage. I said that there isn't a geographical thing named that, and there isn't, but that sort of shows the standard shipping channel today. And so in terms of the area that's actually charted adequately for ships to go through, and it's not very adequate, but it is basically, that's the route. So you can see that that doesn't overlap at all with where either of Franklin's ships might be. There's also a problem in that this is an ice chart. I had to get very familiar with these, especially this summer, but essentially red is bad, lots of ice, blue is good, open water, and this is from August. And you can see that the southern search area is down there. That area tends to open up a whole lot earlier. The northern search area is up here, and the ice stays a whole lot longer into the autumn. So in terms of searching for ships, the southern search area is a whole lot easier. And so people knew this for a long time. Nobody actually got around to looking for the ships until, well, 50, 60 years ago, 50 years ago. In 1967, I threw this in for you, Sheila, as a centennial project, the Canadian Armed Forces sent a bunch of expeditions into the Arctic under the name Project Franklin. And one of the things they tried to do was learn more about the Franklin expedition and about the searches they were actually doing. But this is, I just shiver when I see this picture. But these are a couple of divers obviously going in. You can see the ice behind them, and that water would be brutally cold. And they were going off O'Reilly Island, where Inuit Puzujuk had said that one of the ships had sunk. So they actually dove down there, didn't find anything. So that sort of came and went. But the real fascination, resumption of fascination with the Franklin expedition came with someone named Owen Beatty. I had the luck of showing up at the University of Alberta as a PhD student just at the time that Owen was planning this expedition. And Owen, a biological anthropologist, came up with the brilliant idea that one might be able to learn more about the causes of the expedition by studying the human remains. He studied some of the skeletal remains that have been found, but he also knew that it had long been known that 3 of the Franklin sailors had died that very first winter at Beechey Island and were buried there. And so Beatty took a great deal of difficulty, but he got permission to exhume them, and it turned out they were really well preserved in the permafrost. And so I remember, David, you'll remember too, and Mary, that when this broke, the news broke of this around the world, those images of John Torrington, was one of the 3 sailors, were splashed in the media everywhere. But they were able to autopsy the bodies. They were that well preserved, and that caught an awful lot of the public imagination again into the Franklin expedition. Someone else who did that, much less well known, but equally important from one perspective, was a guy named David Woodman, who went back to the original accounts transcribed by Hall and Schwatka especially, because they'd interviewed a lot of Inuit, and a lot of Inuit had told them things. This had all gone through translation. It was sort of complicated, but Woodman went back to all of it and tried to make sense of it. It's a very complicated book. It's not where to start out, but anybody who's interested in the Franklin expedition and understanding it has to go to Woodman's Unraveling the Franklin Mystery. He wrote that book. He also organized some expeditions. So you can't read this at the back, but he went down to the area west of Grant Point in, I think, early 2000, around 2000, and used a magnetometer underwater to try to locate the ships. Because remember, these ships had steam engines in them. So there would have been an awful lot of iron on board each of these ships. So the idea was that a magnetometer might reveal a magnetic anomaly, and that would sort of provide the location of the ships. He wasn't able to find it. But there were several more private expeditions, but the expeditions I got involved with started in 2008, and it was largely a combination or a collaboration between these groups. Initially, it was totally a collaboration between them. Parks Canada. The Erebus and the Terror, back in the early 90s, were actually declared National Historic Sites. This was considered a bit of an inside joke by some people because they are Canadian National Historic Sites, but we didn't know where they were. But by designating them National Historic Sites, that gave Parks Canada jurisdiction over them, and it allowed them to be protected. It provided sort of protection for them if they were found, because underwater wreck hunters are very interested in things like this. So this gave them some protection. So Parks Canada already had jurisdiction over them. The Coast Guard was involved because they work up there, as you'll see in a moment. Canadian Hydrographic Service are the people who essentially chart the seafloor, create charts so that you can sail safely. And the Government of Nunavut as responsible for the archaeology of Nunavut. So leading up to 2008, these groups got together and said, if we can collaborate, we can actually put on a more concerted search for these ships. And the driving force behind this is the guy in the yellow jacket there, Robert Grenier, who was then Chief of Parks Canada's Underwater Archaeology Service, and an Order of Canada recipient for other work he'd done. In this picture, you got me on the left there, but the captain of the Laurier in 2008, Tom Hull, Doug Stanton, who is the person who's brought me along, Director of Heritage for the Government of Nunavut, and Louis Kamakak, who's from Joe Haven, is a local history expert. He's one of the people from the nearest community who knows most about the Franklin expedition. So this was the sort of planning stages, or the ongoing planning stages for this expedition. So you've got Doug Stanton there on the left. You've got two of Robert Grenier's people there, Jonathan Moore, second left. Then you've got Robert Grenier again. And then you've got Ryan Harris, who, if you watch the media coverage, he's the Parks Canada underwater archaeologist who's got most of the coverage recently, because this has ended up to be his project. And then on the right, you've got Andrew Lazak, who's Director of Hydrography for the Canadian Hydrographic Service. And so how we did it, and I shouldn't say we, actually, because I don't feel responsible. I helped in a small way, but other people did it. But how it was done, let's put it that way. The work was based off a Canadian Coast Guard ship, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, one of our smaller icebreakers, which is based in Victoria, but heads up to the Canadian Arctic each summer. And it has a lot of things to do in the Arctic each summer. One of them is obviously ice breaking. This was a freighter that we had to rescue this past summer. It had tried to take a bit of a shortcut and sort of got itself stuck in ice. There's sort of open water around it, but there's a lot of ice, so we had to steam all night to sort of create a path for it to get through. So ice breaking is one of the things that the icebreakers do, but during the summer when there isn't as much ice, and in summers when there isn't as much ice, a lot of what they do is making it safe for navigation. As you'll see in some of my later slides, a lot of this area is really low and flat, and so sailing around is difficult. So there are all these radar towers or navigation beacons around that provide good radar targets so ships can figure out where they are. But in the Arctic environment, they don't last very long. They break down. So every summer, the Laurier takes them apart and refurbishes some of them. Another thing the Laurier does is search and rescue. In 2013, sort of hard to see, but this is in Cambridge Bay. And those are sea-doos out there, and a little tender. An American reality TV series decided it would be a good idea to sea-doo through the Northwest Passage. And the crew of the Laurier were really hoping these guys would get far enough east that it would be the responsibility of another icebreaker. But so this is about mid-August, as they're sort of stuck in they're waiting to get out of Cambridge Bay, but here we are in early September. We had to rescue them. They got frozen in, so the search and rescue is one of the most important things that they're up there for. But they do support scientists. Life on board is reasonably comfortable. Nice little cabins, 2 bunks, depends on how full the ship is. It can accommodate 48 people total, including the crew. So a couple of the years I was on board, there was enough room where each of us could have our own cabin. We didn't have to share, but a couple of years it was totally full, including this past summer. So we'd share nice little cabins. Shared washroom facilities. There's not a lot of public space on board the Laurier, so sort of long halls. There's a couple of messes. There's a cruise mess with the galley attached, and when the ship is full with 48 people, the cooks work really, really hard, but they always have treats out for people because they do work really hard. There's the officers' mess, and between the two messes, they could get everybody at least two seatings altogether for meals. The aft deck, they did once a week. If the weather was nice, they had a barbecue. They have some barbecues out there. So we had a few nice ones there, although the weather wasn't always this nice. But you could do your own burgers. They have a lab. It's small, but where the scientists on board, which included the archaeologists, could work. And I think they liked us. They had to work really hard when we were on board, but this sort of showed up on a bulletin board a couple of years ago. The main goal of this project was to search for the ships. So it was underwater archaeology. I am, in the words of the underwater archaeologist, a terrestrial archaeologist. My colleagues find that hilarious because it sounds like there's terrestrial archaeologists and extraterrestrial archaeologists. But for the crew of the Laurier, they understand underwater archaeologists because they work on the water. So the stuff we were doing is land-based. But let me focus first on the underwater archaeology. The Laurier is too big to do much of this itself because it involves sort of mapping the seafloor. It's done by dragging these sonar fish, they're usually referred to, behind a boat, and it's used to map the seafloor. So the Canadian Hydrographic Service each year would bring along a couple of launches. They use these all over the country, including in the Great Lakes, so they ship them up north to go on board the Laurier. And they have these two launches that are all equipped to do these things. And so every day they'd be hoisted off the Laurier and put in the water. And then they would do the actual sonar work. Two different kinds of sonar work. One of the problems, remember that map I showed you where the areas where the wrecks were thought to be have not been properly charted at all. I'm not a sailor, or I don't know much about it beyond what I've learned on board these ships, but on these charts, that red line is sort of where we had to go to get down near the southern search area, or begin to get down near the southern search area. But you can see the numbers on the map, which are depth readings, but they're far apart. That island in the sort of the middle right there, Kirkwall Island, is about 3 kilometers long. So there are big gaps between those measurements there that make any captain feel really insecure about sailing in this area. So they needed, in order to even begin the research for the ships, to actually chart the seafloor a little bit. So what we would see as we were doing our work would be these launches going back and forth, these long straight lines, and they would produce something like this. This is a bit of one of their charts. That's about 1 kilometer wide, so from top to bottom there. And you can see there's 10 or so lines. So each one of those lines is one of these launches going back and forth, and each of those numbers is a depth sounding. So you get much closer depth soundings. Then they converted this into color coding, where red is bad and green and blue are good. And so they ended up creating a corridor, essentially, that a ship could safely sail through. At least it would know exactly what to worry about and where to go over that. The problem with what I've just done this is the kind of sonar they need to do that is called multi-beam sonar. Don't ask me to explain it anymore, but that isn't really useful for finding ships. What you need for finding ships, and I go back to this slide because this is what this really is side scan sonar, which essentially creates something that looks a lot like a picture of the seafloor. So they'd do the multi-beam to get the depths, and then they'd go back over it with the side scan. And so here's a whole bunch of side scan sonar pictures of the seafloor in this particular area. And the pictures you'll have seen of the Erebus so far have been made by side scan sonar. But so you can overlay them. It's not all that useful, but it sort of shows you what's going on. So particularly for the first couple of years of this project, that was how it was done. The Canadian Hydrographic Service would let Parks Canada use its launches to do the side scan sonar looking for the ships. In 2012 particularly, something called the Arctic Research Foundation, which was created by, I've got the terminology, I hope I've got that right, by Jim Balsillie and several other people. It's essentially a charitable foundation that was set up to help this project. And what they did was they got a Newfoundland fishing trawler, did some modifications to it, gave it a new name, the Martin Bergman, and essentially stationed it in Cambridge Bay, not too far from the area we're interested in, and it provided another platform that could be used for towing the sonar, the side scan sonar, that would be search for the ships. And so the Bergman, I really admire anybody who lived on board that. I was always on board the Laurier. It is a fishing trawler. It rocks. It's not ice rated, so if there was ice around, it couldn't work in the area. And if there was a storm, it had to find someplace to hide really quickly. But it did a huge amount of work. Okay, I meant to have that up there. The thing over the left isn't in the right location. It's just to give you a sense of scale. Apparently in 2013, the Bergman actually did side-scan sonar over a total of 384 square kilometers. Now again, that's not in the right location, but that just gives you a sense of how much of the seafloor the Bergman was able to cover in one summer. And apparently they did about that much again this summer. So very impressive amount of surveying. And again, much less comfortable conditions than we had on board the Laurier. In 2013, Parks Canada finally got its own launch, so it wouldn't have to borrow the Canadian Hydrographic Services launch. Again, this is one that they use in the south for all sorts of things, so they sent it overland and then down the Mackenzie River and by barge to meet with the Laurier. So that's it's being brought up in 2013. This past summer, they sent it to Halifax, and it was brought along by a chartered cruise ship, the academic Sergei Vavilov, that was chartered by one of the partners. So they brought up the Investigator, it's called. And so that was mounted on board the Laurier as well. So this past summer, we actually had 3 launches on board the Laurier, the 2 Hydrographic Service launches and the Investigator. And so it's bigger, it provided an excellent platform, and it was also something they could dive from, which they did end up needing this year. So terrestrial searches, this is what I was involved in. Our research involved looking on land for traces of the Franklin expedition that might give us a clue as to where the ships ended up. And we did that by using the Laurier's helicopter. They would fly us to points of interest that were fairly close to wherever the Laurier was. Now, it's important to note that the plans for the Laurier's location were always made based on where the Laurier had to be for its own work or where it had to be for the underwater archaeology. So the terrestrial archaeology that Doug Stenton and I were involved in, we really had to work on the basis of targets of opportunity. We found out where the ship was going to be, and then we decided whether there was something near there that was worth us investigating. So they would fly us off in the helicopter, which was a lot of fun. The Icebreaker, it's a little aircraft carrier. They have a flight deck and everything. And we would go to wherever we needed to go. Occasionally, Doug would let me ride up front. We would survey from the air looking for signs of Inuit habitation. What you've got here in the sort of the lower right are some tent rings. These are the rocks that would have been used to weigh down an Inuit tent. And this would give us a clue that Inuit had lived here. And sites of the right age might contain stuff that they'd obtained from Franklin expedition ships. But we didn't have a lot of time. It's a big area. So we often had to make decisions from the air, is it worth landing here or not? Because we only had a certain amount of helicopter time as well. The Government of Nunavut paid the Coast Guard for our helicopter time. It's about $2,000 an hour. We had 10 hours worth this year, and we had to husband it. That became relevant. But if it was worth, we would land, and then this is what we would do, is walk across beaches looking for Inuit sites and examining them carefully for archaeological remains. And if there were archaeological remains like this, then we would look to see whether there were any European goods in it, because Inuit would have had access to stuff from the Franklin expedition afterwards. And so that was one of the things we were obviously interested in terms of helping find the Franklin ships. So these are just more examples of tent rings. They looked varied. There's Robert Grenier on the left there. He was 70 years old the summer he came along with us in 2008, and Doug and I had trouble keeping up with him. Then again, we had to carry all the gear and we had to document things, so that was our excuse. Another tent ring. We also spent a lot of time looking at beaches at wood, because these ships, when they wrecked, there would have been wooden things that would float up and come on shore, and so we were looking for old wood as well. We looked at an awful lot of pieces of driftwood. There's a lot more driftwood up there than you'd expect, without much success. And then at the end of the day, they would fly us back to the Laurier, and there'd be dinner waiting for us. It was lovely. So in 2008, we actually worked in that southern search area down around O'Reilly Island, where Inuktitut had said that the ships sank. And just going through this very quickly, that's what it looks like, these low, flat islands. It really is a flat area, part of the Arctic. What we found that summer was an Inuit tent ring, and you can sort of see there's some yellow flags there. You might be able to see them in this picture. They're marked with the arrows there, but this is a tent ring here with the yellow flagging tape. But inside this tent ring, we found some metal objects. That's a piece of copper there. When we dug it up, that's sort of two views of it, back and front views of it. Obviously European in an Inuit tent ring. We also found a piece of copper. This was clearly cut off the edge of a piece of copper that had been nailed on something. So those are old nail holes. Inuit had cut it off. And another piece of cut copper that had been sort of pounded through. This one's interesting, again, front and back views, but this had been sort of chiseled. This is the kind of work that Inuit would do if they had access to metal tools, but it certainly wouldn't be work that Europeans would do, like punching a hole through that. So this is stuff that clearly Inuit had had access to European stuff. Might have been from the Franklin expedition, but there wasn't any smoking gun. That this really was from the Franklin expedition. 2009, there wasn't, we didn't get into the field. 2010, there was a short field project that I wasn't involved in, and they actually were doing some other things, the underwater archaeologists. Between 2011 and 13, our work focused on Erebus Bay. The way that the search had broken down was by 2012 they had the Martin Bergman, so it would work in the southern search area, and the icebreaker, which was needed to get up into the northern search area, would work in the southern part of that, because they felt that that other ship had drifted south and then got crushed in the ice in the entry to Alexandra Strait. So Doug and I ended up working in the areas that are surrounded in orange, but a lot of our work focused on Erebus Bay because that was where this place was. The so-called boat place. Now, that was again some artist's imagination. It didn't actually end up looking like that, or didn't look like that. There are actually two boat places. One of them is on this little islet that's a kilometer and a half long, and then about 2 kilometers away in the upper left-hand corner of this picture, you can't really make it out, but there's another one. So 2 of Franklin's boats were left in these locations. And I hope you can see in this picture, in between Doug and our assistant, there's sort of a sea of flagging tape. We were using pink flagging tape this summer for some reason, but there's a whole bunch of individual things marked that are on the surface here. And many of them are pieces of wood. The Inuit who'd found this boat had essentially smashed it to bits to get the metal and other fittings out of the boat, really the metal fittings out of the boat. It's sort of surprising because it seems intuitive that the wood would have been really valuable for the Inuit, and clearly some of it was valuable for them, probably some of the longer pieces, but they didn't clearly need it for firewood because they left behind all the smashed little bits they got, and they seem to have done this largely by pounding the wood. And you can imagine oak panels or something would have been difficult to break up, so they went to a lot of trouble to break this up. Just a few bits of interesting things. This is a fragment we found. It's interesting because it's still sort of held together, so you can see sort of the copper fittings, a little rivet and a rove there. But that's what sort of they look like on the ground there in the center. There's a couple of copper nails there. That greenish color is what copper looks like. And this is as we found them, so we haven't dug anything up here. This is just lying on the surface. It's sort of hard to see, but that's a clay pipe. So the Franklin crew had tobacco and lots of these pipes. They brought cases of these pipes. That's a broken one. They had firearms. This is a piece of buckshot. It would have originally been a little bag that would have been in a shotgun for shooting birds, but that's sort of an individual one. But you can see by the scale, it's pretty small there. This, unfortunately, there isn't a scale, but that's a musket ball, so that's much bigger, but lead. Other bits of firearms. They had really good guns and not so good guns. We found like a flint from a flintlock gun, but this is a percussion cap. It's very small, it's tiny, but it was a way of firing these guns. It was sort of a sealed copper little thing that would work in the rain when the gun was wet. So it allowed people to do things. So we find these things lying around. Don't know what this was. This is actually just from this summer, but it's part of an instrument. I'd love to think of it as a sextant or something like that, but it's a little gradiated scale from a sextant. It's just a fragment of something that was much bigger. This is a part of, I call it a pulley, but all the naval types on board sort of corrected me. It's a sheave, or shiv was how they pronounce it. And we were also thinking it's not a dagger used in prison, but a homemade. But it's a little bit of a pulley that's been smashed by Inuit. We found this at an Inuit campsite. There's another piece of it. But remember this before. I'll come to this, or I'll mention this. It's sort of hard to see, but you'll see it better again later. This is clearly a piece of British naval stuff because the British Navy had an anti-theft device. And this goes back hundreds of years. They stamped stuff that they manufactured that belonged to them with something that is known as the broad arrow. It's essentially a little stylized arrow, and you can sort of see it in the middle of this. I don't have a pointer, but it's coming down, the sides come down either side here, and there's sort of a stem here. You'll see a better example later on. But the broad arrow is proof positive this was British Navy gear. This is part of that little shiv, that little thing. So not that there was any doubt about this, but it's sort of nice to see that. We found a couple of these this year, and it's a very evocative item. We didn't know what it was. It sort of looked like Honeycrisp or something like to me, but it's iron. But you can see it's sort of pockmarked on the surface there. But of course, the sailors on board, as soon as they saw it, particularly the knowledgeable ones, identified that this is a sailor's palm. It's for sewing canvas. It would be fixed on leather. You'd wear it in your palm, and those little depressions there, it's like a thimble. It's designed to catch the back of a big sailmaker's needle to push it through the canvas. So we found a couple of these. So the leather part's gone, but that's part of their sewing kit. And there is even canvas and fabric lying around in protected locations. So this is exactly as we found it. It's been sort of on the tundra for 168, 9 years. Other stuff, very evocative at these sites. This is a little, obviously a button from clothing, sort of a close-up view of it. And you can sort of see there's some writing, and we can make out some of it. And once the conservators got through with it, we could identify it as this button was made by Galton Son in Portsmouth. So this was probably on the clothing of one of Franklin's, or this would have been on the clothing of one of the Franklin sailors who ended up at this location. That was 2012, and 2012 was a bit of a media circus. It was my first thing for this, but we had a CBC reporter on board the whole time, which meant you felt very conspicuous. And, of course, the big guy himself, Peter Mansbridge, came up to visit us. He's actually involved in the Arctic Research Foundation that sort of created the Bergman, so he was very enthusiastic. So we had the interesting experience of getting interviewed at this location. That's myself and Doug Stanton, of course. And Doug... Peter really did find that. He really did. We were wandering around after the interview, and he was sort of being impressed by how we could spot stuff on the ground. And then he spotted only the bottom end of this was sticking out, but it's a Franklin Expedition Victorian toothbrush. So this stuff is all really interesting. It's all really evocative for a whole bunch of reasons. But our investigating of it for the Government of Nunavut wasn't just because it's interesting or whatever. This is what tourism looks like in Nunavut these days, and it's increasing. It's heritage tourism. This is at Beachy Island. This is at that first campsite, Franklin Expedition's first campsite, and cruise ships come up into this area, and then they unload lots and lots of passengers who spent a lot of money. It's very expensive going on these cruises to see these things. So you've got a whole bunch of people walking over these locations, and all that stuff I just showed you was lying on the surface of these sites. So these sites are incredibly fragile. And so stuff can be damaged, can be taken, or whatever. So part of what we've been doing is trying to document this stuff and collect stuff that's vulnerable because people are coming to these sites, including the Erebus Bay site as well. It's also another reason. The site that I was showing you, the boat place site, was first found in 1993. And a colleague and good friend of Doug and mine, Dr. Ann Keenley's site, is now at Trent University, analyzed a lot of human remains that came from this. And what she found was really disturbing, but consistent with what the Inuit had told Ray all those years ago, was that some of the last survivors appear to have resorted to cannibalism. What you're looking at are cut marks that Ann identified, and this is sort of a composite, so this wouldn't have been one individual, but this is where she was able to identify cut marks made presumably by steel, or evidently by steel knives, on the human remains found at this site. And there are still human remains on the surface. So this is a scapula, a shoulder blade of someone on the surface of one of these sites. And this there, the little white spot in the middle of the grassed area is looked at closely. We weren't the first people to find it, so it had been identified before we got there, but is clearly the top of a human skull. And so in 2013, we excavated it to recover it to, you'll see what we're going to do with it in a moment, but as we went down, there was a lot more human remains in this spot, all jumbled together, but going deeper. And what we had found there actually was some human remains that Schwatka and his expedition had collected at the boat place in 1879 and then reburied. Some of them had come out, so like that scapula that I showed you appears to have come out of this, but some of the stuff was still buried. So that is what we'd excavated. We brought it south for analysis, but then this summer, along with all the other human remains, it has been reburied in sort of traditional fashion at these sites in rock cairns that are designated because, again, tourists are visiting these sites. So you really don't want human remains lying around on the surface. And so plaques were made back when these sites were first discovered. So this is one of them to the memory of the crew members of Sir John Franklin's expedition of 1845, who died here in the spring of 1848, which is, we think, when these people died. Just one more interesting point that will become relevant. Here's sort of an Inuit tent ring not that far away from the boat place. Wasn't much in it, but what there was a lot of stuff there. And look at it closely. It's a whole bunch of broken pieces of cast iron. And collected this stuff, took it back to the lab. Doug actually did this, but he took the photograph, so there's others of us holding it there. Is part of a traveling, a camp stove, a cast iron camp stove. They really didn't have the lightweight gear we have today, of the Franklin expedition. We haven't been able to research it properly, but you can see it all fit together. But a few pieces are missing. But what's interesting about this is it appears to show what we believe was going on is Inuit were collecting stuff after the Franklin crew members were all dead. They came to this location, collected stuff that they thought might be useful to them, and then experimented with it. And so they essentially smashed up this cast iron to see if there was something they could do with it. They clearly took away a few pieces, but decided that the other stuff wasn't useful or wasn't immediately useful, so left it behind in the tent ring. So that brings us to this past summer. This summer, the field season was different for a couple of reasons. It had a name for the first time. This didn't happen before. It was called the 2014 Victoria Strait Expedition. Otherwise, it had just been Parks Canada's search for the ships of Sir John Franklin. And it had a bunch more partners in addition to those original ones. Parks Canada, Canadian Hydrographic Service, Coast Guard, and Government of Nunavut, and later on, the Arctic Research Foundation. So the Canadian Geographic Society, Royal Canadian Geographical Society became a partner, and a bunch of others. And they sort of described it differently. There was a lot of publicity put out about this, and they talked about, I'm quoting from what's sort of down there, but size you can read, more sophisticated technology. And the plan was exploring the sections of seabed where the ships were last seen for the first time, a task made impossible until now because of thick sea ice in the area. It's not entirely true. Actually, the Parks Canada had visited the location where the ships were reported to be a number of these, but they hadn't done sort of a thorough search. They'd sort of checked it out very quickly with side scan sonar. But they describe, the description on that page, this August, an unprecedented number of public and private organizations will come together to search for the artifacts from the 1845 expedition. And sort of a press release, again, 2014 search for lost Franklin expedition vessels targets new location. And again, new partners bring new resources, technologies, and expertise to the search of HMS Erebus and Terror in their last reported location. Now, this, again, I've got to say that I wasn't involved in the planning of these things. I was assisting the Government of Nunavut, but I wasn't involved in the planning. But this always seemed a little bit strange to me, the way the wording was done, because the focus on the Victoria Strait wasn't where anybody really thought the ships were anymore. We knew based on Inuit testimony that one of the ships had drifted way far south of there, and based on the other Inuit testimony, which wasn't as good admittedly, we believe that one of them had drifted, the other one had drifted south somewhat and got crushed in the ice and sunk. So we didn't really think, no really reliable experts really thought that the ships were still where they'd been abandoned, because they were still floating when the Franklin crew abandoned them. So there seemed to be implicit in these things some doubt about the Inuit testimony. And a bit of light shed on this. I gather he's even here. So article just from a couple of days ago in the KW Record by Greg Mercer, titled "Franklin Mission Fueled by Crucial Local Meeting." And it talked about this. I'd heard a rumor about this, but I didn't know anything officially. The meeting ended after each person took stickers and stuck them in a map of the Victoria Strait, plotting their best guess at the Erebus and Terror's final resting spots. Andrew Campbell, who's a vice president of Parks Canada, and Jim Balsillie, who everyone knows, both thought the Erebus had sunk further north than where it was actually found near King William Island. But so that seemed to suggest that they thought that the ships were way north of where we've been looking. We've been looking in the wrong place all the time. The only published source that really talked about this, a lot of people, if you go on the web and research the Franklin expedition, you'll find there's a lot of writings about it. And some of them are very informed, some of them are less so. This is one of the sort of amateur experts who published in a fairly obscure place. And of Franklin ships, they're likely to be found near where the Victory Point letter says they are, north of King William Island and lying on the bottom of Larsen Sound, which is essentially where Franklin crews left them when they abandoned them. Pretty much nobody thought that, beyond a very few people, but the map that attributed to the Canadian Geographic Society, if you look where this map, which the BBC used, but it sources the Canadian Geographic, says that the search area was supposed to be pretty much right up where the ships were abandoned. And so, again, the terrestrial search that I was involved in, we went wherever the Laurier went, and we did our searches wherever the Laurier did its searches. So we made all our plans based on, okay, we're going to be searching up there. There was important stuff we could be doing. So we had our two plans. You can see that color doesn't show up very well, but the sort of the bluey green there down near the bottom. We got on board the ship early this year in order to do some searching down in the southern area, and then we were going to do a bit more in Erebus Bay, and we were going to do up the northern part of King William Island where the crew first abandoned the ships, because there's a bunch of sites up there that tourists are visiting and that we wanted to document fairly accurately. But a funny thing happened on the way to that plan was that we had a normal ice summer in the Arctic. The last few summers have been really abnormally ice-free. The ice has broken up a whole lot earlier, and in planning for this summer's expedition, people were sort of counting on 2014 being pretty much like 2012, 2013, 2011, but it wasn't. I got very familiar with these. They're called egg charts because of the sort of the lozenges there. But again, red is lots of ice, blue is no ice, and so on. And the area we wanted to get into, there's lots of ice there. At the time, we wanted to get in there, so that wasn't going to be possible. So some planning went on. You've got, this is sort of this year's group. You can just barely see on the left Richard Marriott, who's chief officer of the Laurier, then Bill Noon standing there, who's the captain of the Laurier. Marc-André Bernier, who was the successor to Robert Grenier in sort of heading up the underwater archaeology branch of Parks Canada. Doug Stanton, and then sort of with their backs to us in the hat is Ryan Harris, and you can't even see his face, unfortunately, Scott Youngblood, who's the chief hydrographer on board this time, and then Teresa Nichols, who's communications person for the Coast Guard. But here they're trying to figure out what to do. We can't go where we're supposed to go. What are we going to do? So some planning, that was sort of the plan, but we couldn't get up into the northern search area early enough. So Doug and I and the underwater searches ended up doing some more work in the southern search area, waiting for the ice to clear in the north. So you can see, rather than working up there, we're now down in the southern search area where Doug and I had last worked in 2008. And that is in the area where Inuit Pusajuk, but particularly Schwatka's informants had said that the ship was. So that's where we ended up working. And This is us about to take off. Unlike earlier seasons, it seems we have a uniform this year. There's a very sad reason for that, that one of the other Coast Guard icebreakers last summer, the Amundsen, its helicopter crashed and everyone on board was killed. So as an added safety measure, we had to wear these dry suits, which were designed to keep us dry if we ended up in the water. They were the devil to get into, and very tight cuffs and around the neck. This was the first time we had them on, and I made the mistake of leaving my wristwatch on, and by the end of that day, I couldn't feel my hand from that. But we also sort of decided that it's our age that they made us look like the crew members on the original Star Trek, the red shirts, which was not sort of a good image we wanted to go with. But so I said that we had a limited amount of helicopter time to use. We had 10 hours. By the point that this decision had made, we'd used up about 4 of our helicopter hours, and we had a lot of work that we still planned to do in the north, and we were hoping that the ice would break up in the north, and so we couldn't afford to use up all our helicopter hours at $2,000 an hour. So we were reconciled to not being able to work some days, but this particular day, Scott Youngblood, the hydrographer, needed to go do some work on land. They needed to calibrate their GPS, which they used to do their underwater work. And so he had 2 extra seats in the helicopter available, and he was open to going where we wanted to go, because it didn't really matter to him a whole lot, or it wasn't really important where he went. So we'd looked at a bunch of islands, but Doug Stanton, who made these choices, had sort of a list of the next ones we wanted to get to if we got a chance. So he suggested we go to the next one on our list. Scott looked at it and said, yeah, that'd work for him. So we flew to this location, and that's sort of what it looks like. There's actually Scott. This is a bit, just wanted to get him in there because we owed him with a caribou running away from us at that point. But so he essentially gave us a free ride that day because we didn't have enough money to charter our own helicopter. We set off doing our usual thing. Doug and I were doing the documentation. So Doug actually ends up walking slowest when we're surveying because he has to write everything down. But both of us are sort of photographing things, taking notes. And so our helicopter pilot, Andrew Sterling, who was our security, so he carried around a shotgun for us just in case there was a bear. We normally flew around to make sure there weren't any, but that was his job. But he'd worked with us before, and he knew the kinds of things to look for, and he knew exactly what to do. He'd really got into doing it. Some helicopter pilots just would sit in the helicopter while we did our stuff, but he got right in there with us. He started waving to us from the distance that he'd found something. So went up to it, and this is what he'd found, which was very unusual. We hadn't found anything quite like this before. You can sort of see it there. You'll see it better in a moment. But it's a big metal U-shaped thing, almost 2 feet long. You can see from the context, it's behind one pretty big rock, and there aren't any other really big rocks standing up like that around there. So its location seemed sort of significant. It seemed sort of odd that it would be by the one rock. So, and it's certainly not something that would float or blow up that far from the beach. So it seemed clear that people had put it there. So Doug is doing what he had to do with every find, or what we had to do with every find, but he's doing it for the most part. He's photographing it in situ. We haven't touched it. Andrew was great. He knew exactly what to do, not to touch it, just to call Doug over. Photographed it, documented it, and then it was clearly quite cool. So we got Andrew to pick it up and pose for photographs with it, because this was going to be, people were going to be excited about this, we knew, when we got back to the ship. So Andrew posed with the photograph, and then he passed it to Doug and said, Doug sort of said words to the effect that, wouldn't it be neat if this thing had the broad arrow on it, that would sort of show us it was the British Navy, because clearly it was sort of a big nautical thing, but we didn't know what. So Doug sort of said that, then flipped it over and saw this. It's the number 12 in the middle, and then on either side you can see 2 downward pointing broad arrows. So this was, again, the British Navy's anti-theft device. They stamped this on everything important that they wanted, so this clearly belonged to the British Navy. And in the location where we found this, the only British Navy ships from that era that were known to have been down there were either the Erebus or the Terror, whatever ship that was that the Inuit talked about having drifted down there. So there's sort of another view of one of those broad arrows. So Andrew was interviewed on the radio sometime afterwards, and he quotes me as saying, that's a nice find, because I was actually the first one to come up to him after he found it. That isn't exactly what I said. It was something that I can't repeat in public, but it was... So we got over that excitement. I mean, we were scholars. We thought this was exciting. We knew the Parks Canada, the underwater archaeologists, were going to be very excited about this. But we thought, okay, there's that thing here. What else is there around here? So we carried it back to the helicopter and then fanned out again. And almost immediately, Andrew starts waving and shouting. And again, I'm closest, so I come up. And there he's doing his, sort of indicating what he's looking for. And it's sort of down, there's two things down in the lower left here. I'll zoom in, but there's that thing, which is wood, very weathered wood. And that was in the ground beside it. And you can sort of see at the top, I'll show you better, but a big square nail. So remember I said we'd been walking a lot of beaches looking for old pieces of wood. This was clearly the oldest wood we'd ever found. It was clearly a nautical fitting. We didn't know what it was. We had some theories, but it had these very, very old nails in it. So we did, one of the things we were doing at all of these sites, we were mapping them with a neat piece of technology, a LiDAR scanner. This takes three-dimensional scans of this location. So we did this, a friend and colleague of ours, Dr. Brooke Milne of the University of Manitoba, loaned us. This is sort of a 3D scan. It's rotatable, but not in this version of that area. There's probably about 700,000 or 800,000 individual measurements that make up that. So we've got a very accurate location of where that thing came from, documentation of it. Then you can see how close we were to the helicopter. That was where we landed, and this is where Andrew found this thing. Doug excavated that part. We took those parts back to the Laurier, and we never expected to find anything that big. We hadn't brought the proper size bags back. And then that evening, when the underwater archaeologist, there's Ryan, got back from doing their underwater archaeology, we showed it to him. So there's Ryan sort of seeing these things. He's seeing the wood scuttle cover, and there's that piece there. And Jonathan Moore, Ryan's companion in this, sort of ran off to get copies of the blueprints. And found this. We sort of photographed it on there because the captain, Bill Noon, had sort of figured it out, but Jonathan did it perfectly. This is one of these things. I'll show you closer up. This is a davit for raising and lowering boats from the ship, and the part that we'd found is this metal bit down at the bottom here of the davit. So they're calling it a davit heel or a davit pintle. But so this was from the Franklin expedition. We told Ryan where we found it. The next morning, off went the investigator to do that. We went back to that island because we figured we found these two things. We're going to survey some more. We surveyed around, didn't find anything else. We could see and hear the investigator going back and forth. We were making jokes about there goes the neighborhood because it had been nice and quiet the day before, but now there was a boat sort of going up and down in the water outside. And apparently on their second pass, that's what they found. The Erebus. Now the funny thing was, or funny from our perspective, and again I think they did it exactly right, but I mentioned working with government scientists, and they had a very strict protocol that had been agreed to beforehand about what happened if they thought they found the ships. And so they had to find this, or they had to follow this protocol. So they apparently high-fived, hugged on the investigator, took a group photograph of themselves, and then they came back to the ship and didn't say a word to anybody. Because they had to confirm this with their boss, Marc-Andre Bernier, who you saw in one of the earlier shots, who didn't happen to be on board the Laurier at this point. So it was several days before he actually came back on board the Laurier, at which point they told him, and they told the captain, Bill Noon, of this. And then the next morning, they told all of us after they had shut down the internet on board the ship and collected all the satellite phones on board the ship so that nobody could break this news. Because again, there'd been a protocol that had been agreed to. Again, this is government research, and you got to understand they're doing this for good reasons. They had to figure out how it was going to be announced. And it was well known that our Prime Minister had taken a lot of interest in this project. This project started long before he took an interest in it. I know that, but he certainly took a lot of interest in it. So there was a lot of backing and forthing. And then, so it was decided that the announcement was going to be made at Parks Canada's headquarters in Ottawa by the Prime Minister. But so there's, it's not a very good picture, but Ryan Harrison beaming broadly there, about to get on board the helicopter to go to Joe Haven, to fly south to be at the announcement. Doug Stanton went along, the underwater archaeologist. The rest of us were left on board the ship without any way to communicate with anybody while we were waiting. So we just sort of had to watch television. And of course, because of time delay, the announcement of our finds, the finds that Doug Stanton and I and Andrew Sterling had made, sort of got announced one day. And so got our friend Peter Mansbridge, got a picture of him on the television. But then the very next morning, there's as many of the crew who could squeeze into the lounge on board the Laurier watching the press conference. I've probably taken that during a commercial, but when it was announced. And so then the embargo was lifted. We could talk to people again, but there was more stuff going on. The Minister of Environment, Leona Glukak, who's also responsible for Parks Canada, her home is Joe Haven, which is the local community. So she flew up to visit Joe Haven and came on board the ship and with a bunch of local politicians. You can't see them all there, but the Premier of Nunavut was there. And so because Doug Stanton wasn't back, I had to give sort of a briefing on the stuff that we'd found. Lots of group photographs taken of everybody. It's fun seeing all the Coast Guard in their uniforms. They got all dressed up for these things, but they deserve a huge amount of credit. They work so hard when we're on board. And so I'm delighted for them. Then I had to leave because I have a job here at the University of Waterloo, and the term had already started, and there wasn't any excuse for me to stay behind. And so I came south, and then they went and dove on the wreck. And so I've only seen the pictures that everyone else has seen of this, of the wreck, but this one, something jumped out at me that nobody else had caught. It's part of the wreck there. But if you zoom in on that thing up in the upper right, that's another shiv, a little pulley. It looks to me identical to the fragment that we found. So links these things up together. There's been a lot of media coverage since, and that's been fascinating to watch as well. There's lots of little bits of misinformation. Not too much horrible stuff, but they're quoting John Geiger here as the president of the Royal Canadian Geographic Society. It says he was with the search team that finally confirmed the discovery of the two lost ships. He was on another ship a long way away. Not a really important point, but there's all this little bit of misinformation. The Australian Geographic magazine claimed that the Australian company that charters the cruise ships had actually done this, and all sorts of people wanting to get in credit. There's lots of credit to go around, but I didn't get anything, but apparently the Queen congratulated people as well. What I want to end on, because I've run right up to the amount of time that I sort of allocated. I was hoping to have time for questions, and I will answer questions, but I was hoping to leave more time, is this was a fun project to be involved in, a really interesting one as well. But if you go back to that boat place we were at, when I've been there, it's fascinating for an archaeologist, for an historian to be there. But you also got to remember that something really horrible happened there to some people. I've always found it incredibly sad that, not that these people resorted to cannibalism to save their lives. To me, the really sad part is, because one would do that, is that it didn't work. They did something that would have been incredibly repugnant to them, horrifying to them, I'm sure, and they still didn't survive. I'm really hoping, and it'll be in upcoming years when Parks Canada sort of investigates the wreck, that more information will come from investigation of the Erebus, and hopefully we'll find the terror as well, or they'll find the terror as well at some point, that will shed more light on exactly what these people went through and what decisions they made that led them to do what decisions they were forced to that led them to do this. So I think it's really important to remember the people. It's really exciting and fun to find big metal pieces on the beach and to find a ship underwater, but an awful lot of people lost their lives in a really sad way. And I like the fact that this actually memorializes that. So I'm going to stop at that point. Thank you for being an attentive audience and for staying around so long. And I would be very happy to answer some questions if you have any.